So, speaking of shows, let's go to episode 135, originally broadcast on November 24th, 1991. And one of my favorite people in the wrestling business, Kevin Sullivan, John.
Kevin Sullivan. John, that Boston accent.
Yeah.
Kevin. I mean, Kevin was one of the first guys that I actually became friends with in the wrestling business up in New England, 1975, when he broke in as a rookie. Because I went to school up in Boston, he was a Boston guy. He just took a liking to me, and that friendship endears. Has lasted all of these years later. Did a lot of business with Kevin. Have a lot of stories about Kevin. He one of the most brilliant guys ever.
No kidding.
Pro wrestling, and that's why anytime we had an opportunity to get Kevin on the air was always very informative and a very good segment.
He could wear three hats at the same time. He could be a booker.
Yes.
He could be a main eventer all at the same time. He could be just an agent. He could do virtually anything that a wrestling promotion needed. And really brilliant and a tremendous heel. Between his Florida stint and the thing he did in Smoky Mountain, and those are the ones that pop into my mind. He was just so over the top and so believable in his role. He was one of the, but he's one of the all-time greats. He really is.
Yeah, and one of the most instrumental guys as far as on the creative side in the history of the business.
You know what? He deserves a gold medal for keeping WCW afloat during some pretty hard times, I think.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. He was also a big proponent of Mick Foley, Cactus Jack.
Yeah.
And was one of the reasons why Mick went back there a few times. And his relationship with Kevin was deep and still strong to this day.
Yeah. Kevin is still involved with wrestling here and there.
I just saw him in Vegas at the Cauliflower Alley reunion, and he's there, and he still does like every single autographed show or convention. He's at every single one of them. That's what he does. And he lives out in some island or something. I mean, he lives in a bizarre land of whatever. I mean, I think he said once on the phone to me that he lives on an island with a bunch of Vietnam vets or something. I don't know. I mean, he's just incredible. He's a funny guy, man. Great stories with Kevin, great memories of Kevin, and of course, his marriage to Nancy Sullivan, woman. I mean, that was another big part of my days in wrestling years ago, because there was really nobody like her as well. And, the stories that circulated, but, people can say a lot of things, but all I know is when I saw Nancy and Kevin together, and I traveled internationally with them, they look deeply in love with each other. So whatever the story is, and Kevin doesn't talk about it that much, but what a legacy he's had in the pro wrestling industry since the mid 70s. But a good friend, one of my best friends ever in pro wrestling. I always have admired Kevin Sullivan.
I only had a couple of short hellos with Kevin during the WCW period, but I remember being, I think it was in St. Louis, if memory serves. I forget the city. It was one of the few air trips I took to cover a card. Mm-hmm. And it was after the show, and he is sitting there, and I forget who he was speaking with, but he was wrestling 24/7. They were just talking wrestling after the show. I mean, you figured they'd want to talk about anything else after a major pay-per-view, and they've been working their asses off. No, he talked wrestling all the time.
It's in his blood back then, in his blood today.
Yeah, I admire him as probably in my top 10 of all time creative, just tour de force, one of a kind, nobody else like him, irreplaceable.
Yep.
He's a genius. When it comes to wrestling, Kevin Sullivan's a genius. So I think we should listen to the great Kevin Sullivan. We also get to hear Don Liebel in this clip.
Mm-hmm.
He's the news reporter for the show at the time, and he asked some questions of the guy who used to be known as the Taskmaster.
That's right.
And we're going to find out what Don has to ask right now.
To me, looking over the roster of Ron Fuller, Ronnie Garvin, Malenko, Dean Ho, Dick Slater, Ken Lucas, do you think that was one of the best talented promotions you've ever worked for?
Yeah, if you look at it at that time of that era, it certainly was. You mentioned everybody you mentioned, I agree with. Then there was the Stomper, Tor Tanaka, Fuji when he was in his prime. It went on and on and on. I mean, they had, from the opening match, they had nothing but talent. And one of the things I think that was the reason why it was Knoxville at the time was a real small territory, and the people don't realize now what territories were. Some people in, like, when they had territories in that Oklahoma, Louisiana run, guys were in the car all day and all night trying to get to towns. Where in Knoxville, everything was run, really, the longest trip was 110 miles from Knoxville, and that was Johnson City. Everything else was in a 50-mile radius, so it made it very, very easy.
I think, if I'm not mistaken, Hulk Hogan got started about that time down there as well as Sterling Golden.
Yeah, he did. He certainly did. I mean, they had Bob Orton there, too, at the time.
Jerry
Dick
Blackwell.
Slater, Bob Roop, Ronnie Garvin, the Stomper, Robert Fuller, Ronald Fuller, Jimmy Golden, Timmy Horner just started then, Tony Anthony. They had a host of talent. It was excellent.
You know, one other thing I'd like to ask you about, when you, of course, from the New England area, where you grew up watching more or less the World Wrestling Federation, over the years it seemed Madison Square Garden for me and for John, growing up in the New York area, was always the top card, always the biggest names, or they would bring in new names, but that was a special card. And over the years, I'd say in the last, since 84, 85, Madison Square Garden seems to be just another place to put your show on, nothing special, nothing unique. And I know you started out, I think your first card at Madison Square Garden was in 1975 or so. What was it like for you when you first heard you were wrestling in Madison Square Garden or the Boston Garden from where you were from, and the way it's evolved now to just being a regular card?
Well, even though I wrestled at home in Boston Garden, it was a big thrill for me. But Madison Square Garden was Mecca in those days. I mean, you knew you made it when you got to Madison Square Garden. But the reason why it's just a regular card is the reason why every building's the same now, because whether it's the WCW or the WWF, it's the same talent scene throughout the country. Like you were saying just a minute ago, they used to bring people in when it was a regional promotions. You'd get to see up in Madison Square Garden Dusty Rhodes, who wouldn't wrestle anyplace else than the Gardens. You'd see Roddy Piper come in from Los Angeles. You'd see Chavo Guerrero maybe come in from Texas. You got to see the Funk Brothers coming in from Texas. You got a mixture then of seeing NWA stars with WWF stars. Yeah. I think that was the... and it was taken as what it is. It's Madison Square Garden. You got to see the best of all the talent across the country.
Now, do you think that the promoters don't realize this and say, "Gee, so why don't we have a full house anymore?" It just seems that it's just become just nothing special, and it's a shame because it was fabulous. I remember when Roddy Piper would come in, as you said, they would bring Greg Valentine in to wrestle Victor Rivera from Los Angeles.
They even had a young Ric Flair come in.
Ric Flair came in twice against, I believe, Johnny Rods and Pete Sanchez. Incredible. One other thing, Kevin, growing up in New England, did you ever attend the Santos School of Wrestling or on any of their matches that they presented?
No, I never wrestled for them, and I never attended their school or anything, because when I was getting into professional wrestling at the time, they were just about out of it. You know, I mean, or if they weren't out of it, they were just at a very limited basis.
I remember one other thing in the Boston Gardens area. There was a fellow that was with the organization, Coogie McFarlane.
Yes.
And the guy used to chomp down on his cigar. And I remember one time when he chased John Arezzi out of the building there.
Right out of the Boston Garden, because they attended an opposition show, IWA show, Coogie and Angelo Savoldi threw me right out of the garden, and Richard Nieves, who's here in the studio, asked me, because there's an article in this magazine, Ring Wrestling, an article I wrote about Mario Savoldi, the referee. And I said I did that pretty much as a little bit of a public relations to get in good graces with Savoldi and Coogie again in that area, and I did a nice big spread on Mario for Ring Wrestling, so that got me back in the Boston Garden, believe it or not.
You know, the interesting thing was, I don't know if either of you guys know this, Coogie McFarlane was written up by Damon Runyon and used him in some of his stories.
Yes.
Yeah.
Coogie was pretty well known there. And there was also another guy up in Boston that used to, Jazzo. Remember Jazzo, the little guy with the thing on his head?
I sure do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He was pretty funny. Jazzo he used to be a magician. When I was up in college up there, I did a little special on Jazzo the Clown, and it was pretty funny. Pretty funny stuff.